you actually interviewed 5 American presidents? Richard Nixon, Gerald
Well, I
Ford, Jimmy
interviewed
Carter, Ronald Reagan.
I interviewed them when they were on their way to becoming president, or in the case of Nixon, after he'd been president. I interviewed Nixon in '84 when he was holed up in New York, and he was writing some good books about the need for detente. And by today's standard, Nixon seems very rational and somewhat decent even.
Wow.
I mean, if you think about it, you know, he actually did the opening to China. We're
That's
in
true.
the business of demonizing people, whether it's a Democrat or Republican running this a nation now. We demonize everyone around the world. But Vladimir Putin, we now describe him like he's another Hitler. You know, you know, the government of Syria. Wow, we've got to overthrow them. Gaddafi, the defanged dictator of Libya, who was coming really back to accommodation with the U.S.
And it was relatively stable for decades.
Yeah, we
you know?
had, you know, involved in, now we have, Libya is this big mess, yet we accommodate Saudi Arabia, which is, if there's one country that's responsible for terrorism and grief and everything in the world, it's Saudi Arabia. You know, the connections are quite clear of certainly money and influence, and 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia. And yet we managed to pick a fight with everybody else in the world and still coddle Saudi Arabia. So you don't have adults watching the story. That's something I learned as a very young person. And so in terms of interviewing these presidents, I wrote a book called Playing President, the Konchik books, if anybody wants to look at it. I interviewed, well, Nixon after he was in, but I interviewed Ronald Reagan. I interviewed Ronald Reagan before he was governor of California when he first ran. I got along with him quite well. I mean, my whole thing as a journalist is what we tell kids: keep your listening ears on. There's no reason for the two of us to be talking if you already got everything figured out, and if I already got everything figured out.
Exactly.
If we're not a work in progress.
That's right.
And if we can't change and think and be influenced, there's no point to this exercise. So what's the sense of my talking to Ronald Reagan if I can't get myself psyched up to think, you know, maybe he's got something, maybe he knows something that I don't see.
That's right.
He sees it, you know, even Donald Trump right now. Okay, why do we have to understand, you got to understand Donald Trump, because otherwise you're not going to understand why almost half of the American people are thinking about voting for him.
That's right.
You know, then if you don't understand their anger, their frustration, and if you dismiss them the way Hillary Clinton did, you know, then you're not getting the real tragedy in this country. Those people feel abandoned. They feel ripped off by the economic system and trade agreements and so forth. So when I went to interview Reagan when he was running for governor and against Pat Brown, who had been a big popular Democrat, but now he wasn't. So I want to know what's this guy got? You
exactly.
know,
what does he have to say about the issues?
And how does he think? And he was certainly no simpleton. He started out as a Democrat. His father had worked for the New Deal. He'd had a real life. You know, he'd run a labor union, the Screen Actors Guild.
That's right.
And all the ways of demeaning him, you know, I've always resented this idea if somebody's an actor, then they're not smart. You know, we have gotten, you know, Paul Newman was very smart and a great political person. Mike Farrell right now. Mike Farrell is probably the most useful political observer we have. I think he's fighting to get rid of the death penalty. It's on the ballot here in California. He's fought the good fight for criminal justice and fairness. He's just human rights around the world.
And you have Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone.